It started on a cold, rainy night in November. The kind of night where the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the rain struck the windows with a relentless fury. Anna was home alone, curled up on the couch with a book she could barely focus on. The shadows of the swaying trees outside painted unsettling patterns on the walls, and the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual. She told herself it was just another ordinary evening, but deep down, an inexplicable unease was building in her chest. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. Then came the first knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, like someone lightly tapping their knuckles against the front door. Anna froze, her heart skipping a beat. She glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? She set her book down and cautiously approached the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing. The porch was empty, the street beyond it deserted. The dim porch light cast eerie shadows on the wet ground, but no figure stood in its glow. Anna unlocked the door and opened it slightly, the cold wind biting at her skin. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Only the sound of the rain answered her. She closed the door, locked it, and returned to the couch, telling herself it was just her imagination. Then came the second knock. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Anna's pulse quickened. She approached the door again, her hands trembling as she peered through the peephole. Still no one was there. She hesitated, then called out, "If this is some kind of prank, it's not funny." No response. She locked the door again, double-checking the chain, and returned to the living room. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her eyes darted to the windows, where the rain distorted the view outside. Were those footprints in the mud by the flower bed? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. For a while, the knocking stopped, and Anna began to relax. She even managed to convince herself she'd imagined it all. Until it started again. The sound was different now. Not a knock, but a pounding, heavy and rhythmic, as if someone was slamming their fists against the door. Anna's heart raced. She clutched her phone, dialing 911, but her fingers hesitated over the call button. What would she even say? That someone was knocking on her door? They'd dismiss it as a harmless prank. She decided to ignore it, but the pounding grew louder. It seemed to echo through the entire house, vibrating through the walls. Anna's chest tightened. She moved to the kitchen, away from the front door, clutching a kitchen knife in one hand. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice breaking. The pounding stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It pressed down on her like a physical weight, her own breathing the only sound in the house. Anna backed into a corner, her eyes darting around the room. She tried to call a friend, but the line wouldn't connect. Her phone showed no signal, though it had worked perfectly earlier. A soft knock came from the back door. Anna spun around, her blood turning to ice. The back door led to a small patio surrounded by a high wooden fence. No one could get there without entering the yard, but the gate was locked. Or was it? She crept to the door, gripping the knife tighter. The curtain covering the glass window swayed slightly, as if disturbed by a breeze. Slowly, she reached out and pulled it aside. The patio was empty, the gate still latched. But as her eyes scanned the scene, she saw something that made her stomach churn. On the glass, smeared in the condensation, were the words, "Let me in." Anna stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. She turned and ran to the living room, only to hear another knock, this time from the window near the couch. She spun around, her chest heaving, and saw a shadowy figure standing just outside. The rain distorted its features, but she could tell it wasn't normal. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and it wasn't moving. Anna's vision blurred with tears as she backed away. She tried the phone again, but it was still useless. The knocking resumed, now coming from multiple places at once. The front door, the back door, the windows. It was everywhere, relentless, surrounding her. "What do you want?" she cried, collapsing onto the floor. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation, a way out. The knocking stopped again, and for a moment, she thought it was over. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, filling the room. Voices spoke in overlapping tones, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. Anna covered her ears, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face. "This isn't real," she muttered to herself. "This isn't real," but it felt real. The cold air, the pounding, the whispers, all of it was too vivid to be a nightmare. The lights flickered, plunging the house into darkness. Anna screamed, her voice echoing through the empty halls. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single voice, deep and resonant, coming from the direction of the front door. "Let me in, Anna." Her name. It knew her name. Anna crawled toward the stairs, desperate to put distance between herself and the voice. She scrambled to her bedroom, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She hid in the closet, clutching the knife to her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. The knocking returned, now on her bedroom door. It was slower this time, deliberate, as if mocking her. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, her entire body trembling. The door creaked open. Anna's heart stopped. She had locked it, hadn't she? The sound of footsteps filled the room, heavy and deliberate. Through the slats of the closet door, she saw the figure enter. Its form was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but its presence was suffocating. It stopped in front of the closet, and Anna held her breath, praying it wouldn't find her. But it did. The door swung open, and for the briefest moment, she saw its face, a grotesque amalgamation of human features twisted into a sinister grin. The last thing she heard before everything went black was its voice. "You should have let me in." Epilogue. When Anna's friends arrived the next morning, concerned after she hadn't answered their calls, they found the house in disarray. The front door was wide open, and muddy footprints led from room to room. But there was no sign of Anna. On the living room wall, written in large, smeared letters, were the words, "Thank you for letting me in." She was never seen again. It all began on an ordinary summer afternoon. I had just moved into an old Victorian house nestled at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house had character, ornate woodwork, high ceilings, and a creaky charm that felt like stepping back in time. But there was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. A lingering presence that seemed to hang in the air like a forgotten whisper. I shrugged it off as my imagination and focused on unpacking. By evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the house. Exhausted, I decided to call it a night. That's when I saw him for the first time. I was walking down the upstairs hallway, heading to my bedroom, when I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. Turning, I saw a child standing at the end of the corridor. He looked to be about 8 years old, with dark hair that hung over his pale, expressionless face. He wore clothes that seemed decades out of place, a buttoned-up shirt and suspenders, dirt smudged across his sleeves. I blinked, my heart racing. "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" My voice echoed in the empty hall. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as though studying me, before vanishing into thin air. I stood frozen. The image of him burned into my mind. "I'm just tired," I muttered to myself. "That's all. It's been a long day." I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, though I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every shadow more sinister. The following days brought no sign of the boy, and I began to convince myself it had been a figment of my imagination. But then, things started happening. Small, inexplicable things. Doors I was certain I had closed would be ajar. Lights I'd turn off would flicker back on. And there was the laughter, a soft, distant giggle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was faint at first, so faint that I almost dismissed it as the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct as the days passed. I told myself it was the house settling, that old houses made noises, but deep down I knew better. Something was wrong. One evening, as I sat on the living room couch, the giggle came again, clearer this time. It sent a chill down my spine. I turned toward the staircase, and there he was, the boy. He stood on the bottom step, his dark eyes locked onto mine. This time, he smiled, and it wasn't the smile of a child. It was cold, unsettling, filled with a malice that made my stomach churn. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed toward the kitchen. The air seemed to grow heavier, colder. My breath fogged as I turned to follow his gaze. When I looked back, he was gone. Desperate for answers, I began researching the history of the house. I discovered that it had been built in the late 1800s and had passed through many hands over the years. Most notably, a tragedy had occurred there in the 1930s. A boy named Thomas had disappeared, his body never found. His family left the house shortly after, claiming it was cursed. The parallels were too strong to ignore. Could the boy I was seeing be Thomas? If so, what did he want? I decided to reach out to a local historian, Mrs. Albright, who had an unsettling amount of knowledge about the town's darker past. When I mentioned Thomas, her expression darkened. "You should leave that house," she said firmly. "The boy, he's not what he seems." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach nodding. "They say he's a trickster spirit," she replied. "He lures people in, makes them trust him, but it always ends the same way." I pressed her for details, but she refused to say more. "Just leave," she repeated, "before it's too late." Ignoring her warning, I returned home, determined to confront Thomas. That night, I set up cameras throughout the house, hoping to capture evidence of his presence. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. They were soft, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept out of my bedroom and into the hallway. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath in the dim beam of light. The footsteps led me to the attic door, which was slightly ajar. "Thomas?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. Summoning every ounce of courage, I climbed the creaking stairs. The attic was dark and cluttered, filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. At first, I saw nothing, but then, in the corner, I noticed a small wooden chair. Sitting in it was Thomas. He stared at me, his eyes glinting in the faint light. "Why won't you leave me alone?" he asked, his voice soft but accusing. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and began walking toward me. For the first time, I noticed his feet didn't quite touch the ground. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. As he approached, the room grew darker, the shadows swallowing the light. His expression twisted, his once childlike features morphing into something monstrous. "You shouldn't have stayed," he hissed, his voice no longer that of a child. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the attic stairs. The darkness seemed to follow me, tendrils of shadow reaching out like claws. I bolted to my bedroom, slamming the door and locking it. The laughter returned, echoing through the house, louder and more sinister than before. Desperate, I grabbed my phone and called Mrs. Albright. She answered on the first ring. "It's him," I said, barely able to get the words out. "He's not a boy. He's something else. Get out," she urged. "Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my keys and ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock seemed to have jammed, and the shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into a form that resembled Thomas. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You're mine now," summoning every ounce of strength. I threw a chair through the window and climbed out, cutting myself on the shards of glass. I ran into the night, not stopping until I was far from the house. The next morning, I returned with the police, but the house was empty. There was no sign of Thomas, no evidence of the events that had unfolded. The cameras I'd set up were gone, and the attic was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. I moved out that same day, leaving everything behind. But even now, I can still hear his laughter in my dreams, a haunting reminder of the child that only I could see. It started as a faint echo, a sound so subtle I almost didn't notice. I was alone in my apartment late one night, the soft hum of the television providing background noise as I folded laundry. The voice came from the hallway, distant but unmistakable. It was my voice. I froze, the shirt in my hands forgotten. It wasn't an echo from the TV or a reflection of something I just said. It was deliberate, repeating a phrase I hadn't spoken in days. "Is someone there?" The words I had muttered during a power outage earlier that week. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My apartment was small, just a single bedroom, a bathroom, and an open living space. There was no place for someone to hide, no reason for the voice to exist. Yet there was taunting me. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, an auditory hallucination brought on by fatigue. But deep down I knew better. The next night, it happened again. I was brushing my teeth, the hum of the electric toothbrush masking all other sounds. When I turned it off, the voice greeted me. This time, it was louder, clearer, and chillingly familiar. "Why are you here?" it asked, mimicking the tone I used when talking to myself in moments of frustration. I spun around, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The bathroom light flickered. A soft chuckle echoed, but no one replied. I searched the apartment, every closet, every corner, but I was alone. The days that followed were unbearable. The voice grew bolder, mimicking not only my words but my intonations, my sighs, even my laughter. It spoke when I was in the shower, when I was trying to sleep, when I was making coffee. It knew my routines, my habits, and used them against me. One evening, as I sat on the couch, I heard it call my name. My stomach churned as I realized it didn't come from the hallway this time. It came from right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. I couldn't take it anymore. I confided in a friend, Sam, who offered to stay over. That night, the voice was silent. Sam laughed it off, saying I'd probably been imagining things. But as soon as he left the next morning, it returned. Desperate, I contacted a paranormal investigator. She arrived with equipment I didn't understand, EMF detectors, digital recorders, and something she called a spirit box. As she walked through the apartment, her expression grew grim. "There's something here," she said, her voice low. "But it's not a spirit." "What do you mean?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "It's a mimic," she replied. "An entity that feeds on fear, using your own voice to unsettle you. It's rare, but dangerous." She instructed me to ignore it, to deny it the reaction it craved. Easier said than done. That night, it screamed my name, a blood-curdling sound that rattled my nerves. I clenched my fists, refusing to respond. The voice laughed, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to me. Days turned into weeks, and the mimic's torment escalated. It began to speak in the voices of my loved ones, calling out for help, begging me to come closer. The breaking point came when it used my mother's voice, pleading for me to save her. Fueled by anger and desperation, I shouted, "Leave me alone." The apartment fell silent, an oppressive stillness that felt heavier than the voice itself. Then it spoke, using my voice one last time. "You shouldn't have done that." The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. Shadows stretched and writhed, coalescing into a shape that stood in the center of the living room. It didn't have a face, but I knew it was watching me. I grabbed a jar of salt the investigator had left behind and flung it at the figure. It let out a bone-chilling shriek, dissolving into the shadows. The room returned to normal, the mimic seemingly vanished. The voice hasn't returned since that night, but I'm not at ease. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows feels like a warning. The investigator told me to move, to start fresh somewhere new. But even if I left, I can't shake the feeling that it's still with me, waiting for the perfect moment to mimic me again.